Hey guys, LC Holt here, and this is my update for December the 31st. It is the last show of the year. Can you believe that? And let me tell you, we're going to be talking about the Zodiac Killer. This is part 2 in our Zodiac Killer series. Today we're going to be talking about the suspects, or at least a few of the suspects. And as always on the show is my co-host. Whenever I talk about the Zodiac Killer, you know Zach Myers is going to be around. Zach, how you doing today?
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome to Jeffrey Dahmer's refrigerator.
Oh my God! Wow, we are. Well, Zach, I should probably tell you and the audience that we're actually not doing Jeffrey Dahmer today. We're going to be doing the Zodiac Killer, but we'll do Jeffrey Dahmer again some other time. But so while I'm probably, I suppose, being taken out of Jeffrey Dahmer's refrigerator, I'm going to go ahead and give you guys the skinny on the first suspect that we're going to be talking about today. It's a young guy named Ross Sullivan. And I will explain why Ross Sullivan is suspected of being the Zodiac Killer here in a minute. But before I do that, I'm going to show you, give you a little visual aid of what Mr. Sullivan looked like. Okay, so that is Ross Sullivan. He was born in 1968, which would have made him about 27 the year that the official Zodiac Killer crimes took place. What we're going to talk about today, though, is a crime that Ross Sullivan is suspected of committing prior to the Zodiac killings. And it is the murder, actually, of a young girl in Riverside, California, a girl by the name of Sherry Jo Bates. Okay, now Sherry Jo Bates is considered by a lot of people to be possibly the Zodiac's first victim, mainly because there are a lot of similarities between not so much her death, but the aftermath of her death and the Zodiac. Now, she was 18 years old in October of 1966. This particular crime took place on October 30th of 1966 at City College there in Riverside, California. And she was going to the City College in Riverside. She was a student. She went that night to the library to do some studying. At around 9:30 p.m., thereabouts, she left the library, went out to her car, and found that it wouldn't start. So what happened was, apparently somebody came up to the car, her window was down, and said that they could help her or at least give her a ride. Maybe she knew the person, maybe she didn't know the person, but the fact is she left with the person. And she walked about 100 yards down the street there to where there was an alley. And when they got to the alley, whoever this person was grabbed Sherry Jo Bates, pulled her into the alley, and then proceeded to beat her and stab her to death. And I mean, it's a very, very sad case. Again, she was 18 years old, very young, very pretty young girl. There was some evidence found on the scene. There was a man's Timex watch that she apparently pulled off during the struggle. And there was the heel of a military-style boot. And as we discussed on the previous Zodiac show, the Zodiac was known for wearing a military-style boot. Now, this was not the same military-style boot that was found at Lake Berryessa with Brian Hartnell in them. This was a different brand, but apparently it was around the same size, around the size 8 or 10, which would have been about the size that the Zodiac wore based on. And also the watch was traced back to a military post in England. So big military connections between, you know, for the Sherry Jo Bates murderer. Beyond that, nobody really has any idea who the guy was. They thought that maybe it was a jilted lover or somebody that had been stalking her. Again, she was a very pretty young girl. The thing about Ross, and there were several people suspected of the case of being the murderer, but Ross Sullivan was kind of brought to light a little later. There was another guy who was cleared on DNA evidence eventually. Ross Sullivan, come to find out, worked in the library the Riverside City College Library. And he was known as being a little bit off kilter. The thing about him is he often wore, oh, Zach, you're back.
Hey there.
Wow, I'm not in your refrigerator anymore.
Yeah, I don't know what that was about. Sorry.
Well, as I was telling everybody, Ross Sullivan often would wear a military-style jacket and boots. And again, we have to remember that the murderer wore military boots. There are a couple other things that I'll get to here in a moment. The primary reason that a lot of armchair detectives think that this was the Zodiac who murdered Sherry Joe is because of a letter that was sent to the police and to the local Riverside newspaper, and it was sent on, it was mailed on November 29th of 1966, so almost exactly a month after her murder. And I'll show you the letter. Now keep in mind that the Zodiac is very famous for sending letters to both the police and to the newspapers. That's something that he would later do with some of the other, cases. And it says, "The confession by blank." And I'm not going to go through, I'll probably read this. We're planning to do a show later on specifically on the letters and the ciphers. This is kind of long and rambling, but essentially what it says is it says that he picked her because she was young and beautiful. There's one part where he describes apparently what happened to her that night. He said he waited for her in the library and followed her out after about 2 minutes. The battery must have been dead by then because he had pulled the wire, is what it says here. Why the car wouldn't crank, he had disabled the motor. But he said the battery had been dead by the time she got to the car. She says she was very willing to talk to me. I told her that my car was down the street and that I would give her a lift home. When we were away from the library walking, I said it was about time. She asked me about time for what? I said it was about time for her to die. I grabbed her around the neck with my hand over her mouth, the other hand with a small knife at her throat. She went very willingly. Her breasts felt very warm, blah, blah, blah. So he starts getting really fucking weird and nutty, right? As these guys usually do. So that was sent to the police and to the newspaper. Also, there was a desk that was later found within the library that had a very bizarre poem etched into it. And I'm going to show you that too. And you'll notice that the handwriting on the desk does somewhat resemble the Zodiac letter handwriting. That's not to say that this is the Zodiac, but this was found on the desk of somebody within the library where Sherry Joe was last seen. Okay, and that's what it looked like. It says, well, you can probably read it. It says clean, infrared clean, blood spurting, dripping, spilling all over her new dress. Oh, well, it was red anyway. Life draining into an uncertain death. She won't die. This time someone will find her. Just wait till next time. And beneath it is letters, initials that look like RH. So what are you thinking about that, Zach? A couple pieces of evidence there surrounding the Sherry Joe Bates murder. Go ahead.
That's really fascinating. Gee, I thought my handwriting was bad.
Yeah, well, what do you think? Do you think, based on the Zodiac letters later, that handwriting that was on the desk looks anything like the Zodiac's?
It resembles quite a bit. There's a lot of people's handwriting that probably resembles the same. But yes, that particular handwriting does match pretty close to the Zodiac's.
Yeah. So in terms of the case of Sherry Joe Bates and her murder, very different in MO from what we know about the Zodiac, in so much as, she was stabbed, and well, I mean, the people at Lake Berryessa was stabbed, but they weren't really savagely beaten and stuff the way she was. It seems to be a crime of passion. you know. And I believe in that confession letter I showed you, it does mention something about that this was someone who, you know, that the killer asked out or something like that, and she denied him, so that maybe this was a bit of a revenge killing. Which, as far as we know, Zodiac never sought revenge, you know, against anybody. They seem to be very random. Though you could argue that perhaps Darlene Ferrin, if what was stated by Mike Michaud is true, that maybe that was more personal than the others, because Darlene said that she knew the person who was following them that night, who may or may not also have been the person who shot them at Blue Rock Springs. So, thoughts on Ross Sullivan and Sherry Jo Bates? What do you think, man?
Those are some really compelling evidence against him. Yeah, man, he could definitely be the Zodiac, but, you know, there's a lot of suspects that have, you know, if not the same, maybe more evidence against them. Like Rick Marshall, for example.
Yes, yes. And before we go into Rick Marshall, let me just say one thing about Ross Sullivan. He was a lot younger than a lot of the other suspects, and he was a little bit younger than what the description of the Zodiac Killer, who, you know, by witnesses who saw him and lived, you know, he seems to be a little on the young side. Ross, I would say another thing that's going against him, he seemed to be a bit of a chronic schizophrenic. He had serious mental problems, and he was committed for periods of time. So he showed outward signs, apparently, of mental illness. I'm not entirely convinced that the Zodiac showed outward signs of mental illness. I think that maybe he was somebody who could function day to day, but held it inside. Ross Sullivan doesn't seem to be someone who could function all that well day to day. People noticed there was something weird about him.
Yeah, knowing that, yeah, that the Zodiac was quite intelligent. He planned everything. I mean, for God's sake, he knew how to make bombs. All this stuff he planned out. Like, he never got caught. That takes a very high intelligent person. I just, you know, it's not. I don't think anybody that crazy could really, you know, be doing it.
Yeah. And like I say, who knows? I think it's a good chance that Ross Sullivan maybe killed Sherry Jo Bates. But again, we don't really know if the killer of Sherry Jo Bates was the Zodiac. So if Ross Sullivan killed Sherry Jo, that doesn't necessarily mean he's the Zodiac. First, you would have to definitively tie that case in with the others, which most sources do not. Like, a lot of the police think that Sherry Jo was murdered by somebody, and this had nothing to do with the Zodiac. This was just something that was sort of similar, and, you know, it was further south. It is worth noting, though, that Ross Sullivan actually, just before the Zodiac killings happened, the official ones, moved to Northern California, which is where the actual Zodiac killings happened. Again, doesn't mean that he did it. It just means he happened to move. And we'll talk more in this episode about people who happen to move places. But before we get to that, just before somebody dies. But just before we get to that, we'll get on to who you were talking about, Rick Marshall. Now, I want to go ahead and show the audience Rick Marshall so that you have some idea of who we're talking about.
One day, Rick invited over some friends to his house and some other, you know, ham radio enthusiasts, and they felt like he was super strange and had very similar qualities to the Zodiac. The police found the evidence quite compelling and put him on, actually, for all that evidence, they put him on the prime Zodiac suspect list for a lot of pieces of evidence. For example, the first being that he lived within several miles within the first or the last known Zodiac murder.
Oh, really? Yeah. So that would be the murder of Paul Stine, which was in September of '69.
Yes.
Well, it's interesting you point that out, because later we'll be talking about other people who happened to live very close to the Paul Stine murder when it happened. But go ahead.
And he also lived within miles of Sherry Joe Bay.
Oh, really? Rick Marshall did?
Yes. And he also owned a Royal typewriter and a teletype machine, which is similar use to the one that the Zodiac used. Now, we all know what a typewriter is, but a teletype machine is kind of just one of the original like messengers, if you will. Like, you type out a letter, send it in, and it sends to another teletype machine. So,
Oh yeah, yeah.
but
So yeah, it was like an early version of Messenger, just with paper. Yeah.
And the ones that he owned were the ones really identical to the ones the Zodiac used. And so that was for all that evidence, they kind of were keeping a close eye on him and stuff like that. Well, and Rick also worked at a movie theater. And he worked as a projectionist. Now, Rick would also draw up the posters for a lot of these movies and stuff. And one of them was the most dangerous game. I'm sorry.
All right, so let's remind people. Well, back when in our first show, we were talking about one of the only Zodiac cipher that was ever decoded, and it had a reference to what was a book and then became a movie, something called the Deadliest Game. What's it called? The Most Dangerous Game?
Yes, the Most Dangerous Game.
Which is a story about people who get stranded on an island and they wind up getting hunted by a guy with bows and arrows, and he hunts them like you would hunt animals.
Exactly. Yeah, and they felt this was quite compelling because the Zodiac did make a reference to this, and Rick Marshall obviously, took a great interest in this film. And by the way, let everyone know the movie theater he worked at was called The Avenue.
All right, and it showed silent films?
Yes, silent films.
Okay, now so he drew the posters that were shown there, right?
Yes.
Well, I just so happen to have one of those posters. Would you like to see it, Zach?
Yes. Oh, wow, look at that.
Yes, that is a poster that was drawn by Rick Marshall. That's his handwriting. Now, if you're familiar with the Zodiac case, you probably know the handwriting of the Zodiac used in his letters. And, you look at that and the slanting of the words and so forth is it looks very similar, because remember the Zodiac, when he would write, the letters would always kind of slant a little bit to the right, You see down there at the bottom, they sort of slant to the right a bit. It's interesting. Now, does that, of course, does that, go ahead.
Oh, that was just the fact that, and another thing that he used was, they showed a movie called The Red Phantom, which he also did the poster for. And in one of the Zodiac letters, he signed Red Phantom.
Oh, that's right. It was a later Zodiac letter. And again, when we do the shows about the Zodiac, his communications and his ciphers, will show that. But there was a letter that was written later in this whole thing in which the Zodiac signed the letter, the Red Phantom. Now, some people dispute the authorship of that letter. Some people don't think the Zodiac wrote it, because there were a lot of hoaxsters. We have to remember that the Zodiac was a very high-profile case, and people wanted in on the action, so they would write in their own Zodiac letters. But that is an interesting, So Rick Marshall.
The police kind of, didn't really, of course, go further because none of his fingerprints or anything like that was ever found in any of the crime scenes, which, a lot of people, the same thing. So that's why he never really got charged with anything. But what's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a very interesting. I remember reading in Robert Graysmith's book that he considered Rick Marshall there for a minute because of the handwriting. And I think I read in Graysmith's book that Sherwood, who did the analysis of handwriting for the Zodiac case, said that Rick Marshall's handwriting was very close to the Zodiac's. Yeah, and the fingerprint evidence that we have to go on really only comes from one case, because that was in the case of Paul Stein, the cab driver who you mentioned before, who was killed on Washington and Cherry in San Francisco. The Zodiac actually left behind a bloody thumbprint at that, which has never been matched to any of the suspects. Since then, we've had all kinds of new advances in criminology, and now they can find palm prints off letters, you know, where he put his hand down and rested his palm as he was writing them. And we actually have, I think, a partial palm print, you know, you know, as if we're the fucking cops, but they have a partial palm print of the Zodiac. Now, I don't know if it would be possible to get Rick Marshall's palm print this far. I mean, I'm assuming Rick Marshall, how old was he when this happened?
He was 40 years old.
Okay, so he's probably dead now, huh?
Oh, yeah.
so that I wonder if it would be possible to get his palm, I mean, since the handwriting is what seems to tie him to it, people saying that the handwriting is very similar. For him especially, I think it would be good to be able to check the palm print of the Zodiac against his, since they do have that now from the Zodiac letters that we know he wrote. I mean, one in which we absolutely know he wrote because Paul Stein's bloody shirt was in it, you know, so it's kind of hard to fake that. That definitely wasn't a hoaxster. But yeah, I think that's very interesting. Again, it's hard to say. That's the thing about all these suspects, is it's just so hard to say for sure, because as we learn with the Zodiac case, every time you have a few pieces of evidence that look really good against somebody, you'll find, you know, a few pieces that look really good for them. So it's kind of hard to balance it all out. I would love to have somebody you could definitively say was the Zodiac, but so far we are not there yet. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying. And in honor of trying to figure this shit out, we're not going to figure it out, you and I, on this show, but we're going to go over. You want to move on to another suspect now?
Let's do it. Who you got?
Well, I got this guy. Listen, there's this guy named Richard Gaikowski. All right, I'm going to show you a picture of him. You want to see a picture of him?
Yeah, I do.
All right. That right there, ladies and gentlemen, is Richard Gaikowski, and he looks like he's having a tremendously wonderful day. Look at him, all smiles and everything. But let me tell you something.
That man is all teeth.
I tell you what, if he didn't have teeth, he wouldn't have anything. But I'm going to tell you something else. He was not always smiling like this. You want me to tell you why?
Why?
Well, one reason he wasn't always smiling like this is because he hated the police. He was not a big fan. In fact, he was a part of a commune in San Francisco who also published a newspaper called Good Times. And I'm not talking Jimmy Walker type Good Times, okay? These guys hated the cops and were very pro-violence. It was counterculture. You have to keep in mind, this was the late 60s. The cops were pigs, right? But at one point, he actually went so far to try and expose the county jail as having terrible conditions that he actually refused to sign a traffic citation, which resulted in him getting arrested just so that he could go to the county jail and write an expose about what the conditions were like inside. So this was a pretty dedicated counterculture journalist, Richard Gaikowski, okay? Now, he was 32 in 1968, which is when the first official Zodiac killings took place. He was born in South Dakota, served in the Army. He was a medic in the Army back in the 1950s. And there are a couple interesting things about him. One interesting thing is apparently he knew Darlene Ferrin. Now, Darlene Ferrin was the young lady who was with Mike Michaud who got shot at Blue Rock Springs. Again, I mentioned her earlier. She's the one who possibly might have known her attacker. Might have known the guy who was following them. And if the guy who was following them really was the guy that shot them, then she apparently knew who that was. Okay. Now, the reason I say that Gaikowski knew Darlene Ferrin is because he moved to Albany, New York in 1966 at the same time that Darlene and her husband moved there. And he actually worked in the same building as Darlene's husband while they were in Albany, New York. Now, you could always say it's a small world. And it is kind of like a small world. You know what I mean? But that is an interesting connection. Now, I should say a lot of this information comes from Tom Voigt, who runs a really great website called ZodiacKiller.com. And he loves Richard Gaikowski as a suspect. And I can see why to an extent. I was talking before about Paul Stein. You mentioned that there was a connection with Rick Marshall, with Paul Stein. Well, there's also a connection with Gaikowski because the corner where Paul Stein was shot is actually only yards away from Richard Gaikowski's cousin's house.
Really?
Yes. So let's just say that Richard Gaikowski was the Zodiac, okay? Just devil's advocate. He could have plugged Paul Stein in the back of the head, cut the shirt, and then simply walked to his cousin's house and disappeared off the street. Now, it also goes a little bit further with Paul Stein because Gaikowski, the switchboard, what they called the switchboard for Good Times, which was the newspaper, the counterculture newspaper I was telling you about that Gaikowski wrote for, its headquarters was right down the street from Paul Stein's house, okay, where he lived, only yards apparently away from it. And Paul Stein's sister says that Richard Gaikowski was at her brother's funeral, which, again, maybe just small world, right?
Yeah, it could be, but I mean, those are a lot of coincidences too.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there are a lot of coincidences. There was a time when Gaikowski was, a very short time, when he was investigated by one of the Zodiac detectives, a guy named Ken Narlow. And he was investigated partly because of what Darlene Ferrin's sister, Pam Huckabee, said. She said that he was obsessed with Darlene and should be investigated. Now, the reason that Tom Voigt at ZodiacKiller.com has kind of reinitiated this Gaikowski thing is because there was a guy who knew Gaikowski back in the day who goes by the alias of Goldcatcher. And he recorded a lot of conversations he had with Gaikowski about the Zodiac killings. And Goldcatcher says that he is, I guess, totally sure that Gaikowski was the Zodiac. I don't know. What do you think, Zach?
Me personally, no, I don't think it's him. There's a lot of good evidence against him, but I'm not quite convinced.
When we're talking about the Zodiac letters later on when we do that show, we'll point this out. But since we're talking about Gaikowski now, another piece of evidence that a lot of the armchair detectives point to is that when you look at one of the ciphers, the Zodiac ciphers, right in the middle of it, you can see G-Y-K-E, Gaik. And Richard Gaikowski went by a nickname. He used to call himself Dick Gaik, right? But apparently he did not spell it G-Y-K-E. He spelled it G-A-I-K, which is literally the shortened version of his last name, Gaik. Some people say that he spelt it both ways. If you want to believe that he's a suspect, you would say that he spelt it both ways. But I think I said that in our last show, if you look at those ciphers upside down and in a mirror, you could probably find my name in them and your name in them. So you kind of have
both in there.
You think we're both in there?
Oh yeah.
I think if you see Gaik, you look up and to the right and it says lamb, and then upside down and kind of crossways it says mask. And then if you see Gaik and you go down and to the left, it'll go Zach. And then right across the bottom, it's like the MY, and then you have to jump up 3 spaces, and it's the rest of your last name. Now, I'm not saying this is for certain. I'm not saying this is for certain, but it's a distinct possibility that that could be there. So that's Richard Gaikowski. He also had a little bit of a hissy fit at one point and was committed. Now, I'll point this out because this is another piece of evidence that amateur sleuths kind of go into. He had a nervous breakdown and was committed to the Napa State Hospital. And he stayed, and this happened right after one of the last Zodiac letters before the Zodiac stopped writing for 3 years. So some people who think it was Gaikowski said he wrote that last letter, and then after everything, Paul Stein and all the rest of them, he just snapped, went crazy, and went into the hospital and didn't write again for another 3 years. Again, could just be a coincidence of timing, because those things happen, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
If you take everybody in San Francisco and you looked at them and you went, okay, well, this person moved here, and that would coincided perfectly. When the Zodiac was not writing letters, you could have a lot of different Zodiac suspects. And I think this is something we've talked about kind of privately before. It seems like everybody who had an abusive father, or a father that was just like didn't let him go out with the girl that they wanted to, that became, you know, he years later after he died, conveniently, he became a Zodiac suspect, you know, and they started writing books about, my dad was the Zodiac. That's why we're not going to.
The Zodiac.
What'd you say?
Everyone's dad's the Zodiac.
Yeah, it seems like it. I remember seeing, I mean, there were a lot of weird ones. People were writing books there for a minute. Every 5 seconds, there was a new book about how my dad was the Zodiac or my stepfather was. I remember seeing one that was on, I think it was one of those shows like Hard Copy or something. And it was a very dramatic revelation of where the guy had an old television set and he took the guts, I think, out of the TV and reached into it and pulled out a black hood with the Zodiac symbol drawn on it. And it's like, see? My father hid this here all these years. And I would say it looked really cheap, by the way. It looked like something we could make in an hour, you know. The easiest way of figuring out if that's bullshit or not is just show it to Brian Hartnell. Right? Brian Hartnell was there. He saw what the actual hood looked like. Show it to him. He's still alive. Show it to him. Say, does this look like the thing that the guy that stabbed you was wearing? If he says no, then that stepfather was bullshit, you know?
Which most likely it is.
Yes, most likely the stepson made that just before Hard Copy came over. He was like, I got to take a trip to Walmart. I need to get some hood material and some chalk. But we're pointing this out just because we're talking about suspects, and there are a myriad of them. We have gone over 3 of them so far, and we have another one coming up. Who do we have next, Zach?
We have Lawrence Kane. Now, Lawrence Kane was 45 years old when all this was going on.
Oh, before you start talking, let's show him what Lawrence Kane looked like. I almost forgot.
See what Lawrence looks like.
All right, that's Lawrence Kane. He looks like
fit the description to what supposedly what the Zodiac looked like.
He looks like he could have been Eddie Haskell's father on Leave It to Beaver.
He probably was. I'm pretty sure Eddie Haskell said that his father was the Zodiac.
I bet Eddie Haskell probably wrote a book about how his father was the Zodiac.
And we're going to start the story off with Lawrence here. When everybody was deciphering the code that the Zodiac put in the letters, they got the name out Kane, which actually is spelled the exact same way that Lawrence spells his last name, Kane. So the investigators also got info from Pam Huckabee, the sister, or Pam Huckabee is the sister of Darlene Ferrin.
Oh, right. Yes, the same person who said that Gaikowski was obsessed with her sister.
Exactly. So these two kind of tie a little bit together. And Pam Huckabee actually said that Kane was following her sister around for months before she was murdered, just like the other one.
What would be interesting to know, was there anybody in Napa County that was not following Darlene Ferrin? I mean, I know Darlene was a very popular.
Following her, you think she would have noticed?
Darlene was a very popular girl, and I swear to God, I think every male of a certain age bracket was following Darlene Ferrin the night she was murdered.
And a different Zodiac victim pointed Kane out as her abductor so yeah, that's two people who kind of pointed at him.
Yes, and I think I know exactly who you're talking about. You're talking about Kathleen Johns.
Yes, I am.
Would you like, before you go on about Lawrence Kane, for me to tell the audience a little bit about Kathleen Johns?
Yeah, they should know.
Okay, so March 22nd, 1970, Modesto, California. Kathleen Johns, she's pregnant at the time, 7 months pregnant. She already has a 10-month-old kid in the car. So, you know, she got around too. No, I'm just kidding, Kathleen. I'm just kidding. But anyway, she was traveling to go visit her mother, okay, in all seriousness. And a car pulled up behind her and was honking its horns. Usually cars only have one, but it was honking its horn. And Kathleen goes, "What's this guy going on about?" Right? So she's driving. Well, the guy pulls over to the side of the road, to the side of the car, and says, "Hey, you need to pull over." And so she pulls over, thinking something horrible has happened. Well, the guy gets out and walks over to her car window and says, "The back tire of your car, something is loose there. So I'm going to fix it for you." And then, good Samaritan. Kathleen's like, "Good, man. Hey, thanks. Don't expect a tip, buddy, because I didn't ask for this." But anyway, he goes and he gets a lug wrench and he tightens, apparently, the lugs on her car tire. Then he says, "Okay, bye." And she's like, "Thank you, sir. Kind sir." And then he goes back, gets in his car, and she starts to drive. Well, she only makes it a few yards before her tire comes off the rim. So, come to find out, what happened was the guy loosened her lug nuts. He didn't tighten them. There was nothing wrong with her tire. But now he's got her with no tire. And he says, "Tell you what, that crafty son of a bitch." And so guess what he does? He says, "Honey, grab your baby." He didn't realize she has a baby. When he sees the baby, he's like, "Oh, God. I was hoping she was single." But he says, "Get into the car." He didn't really think that. But get into the car. I'm going to give you a drive. I'm going to give you a drive. I'm going to give you a ride, baby. Right down the street here to this gas station. So she's like, "Geez, you're a really good guy." Not realizing that he's the one that fucked up her tire. So she gets into the car and he starts to drive. And he passes the gas station. And he keeps on going. And this guy drives her around for about an hour and a half. And he drives her all over the place. And the whole time he's sitting there telling her in kind of a monotonic voice, "I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you, and then I'm going to throw your baby out the window, and I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to throw your baby out the window." And she's going, "Jesus Christ, this guy is not a good Samaritan, and I wouldn't date him if he was the last man on earth. He's going to kill me." And so what he does at one point is he starts to go up the on-ramp to get on the freeway. Well, he goes up the wrong on-ramp. He goes up the one you're supposed to come down. And she's like, "Oh, geez, he's backing up. He's slowing down. I'm going to grab my baby and get the hell out of here. This guy's been terrorizing me." So she hops out of the car and runs off out into the woods and kind of hides for a few minutes. And there are differing reports. Sometimes she says that he got out with a flashlight and went and tried to find her. Other times she said that he didn't get out. He just drove away. So whatever happened, she hid over there until he left. And then the cops picked her up and they take her to the police station. And when they're sitting at the police station, she happens to look over. And again, remember, this is March 22nd, 1970. The last Zodiac killing was in September of 1969. So the mugshot from the Paul Stein case is not the mugshot, but the artist rendering, the composite sketch, is up on the board there in the police station. And, you know, she sees that rendering, that artist rendering, and she says, that looks exactly like the guy that picked me up. The Good Samaritan who was trying to give me a ride to the gas station. That's him. So that's how this got tied in to the Zodiac case. So that is the story of Kathleen Johns in a nutshell. There is some controversy because she was having trouble with the man whose baby she was about to give birth to, and some people said this never happened at all. This was a cry for attention. So who knows? But that's the case of Kathleen Johns. And as you said, leading back into Lawrence Kane now, she said that Lawrence Kane was the guy that picked her up in the car. Is that correct?
Yeah, but see, and Kane was arrested in August 1968, as a suspect. And when he was released, he was in a massive car accident and suffered horrible brain damage.
Ah, so this would have been prior to the Kathleen Johns incident.
Yes. And I guess the doctors said that he lost the control he lost the ability to control self-gratification.
Okay, that's interesting.
One of the big things that was noted about him was that.
Okay, that's interesting. So,
but a big reason why I don't think he was a suspect, and that's why Lawrence is on here. But I don't think that he was the Zodiac, because he suffered such horrible brain damage because of this car accident that, like we mentioned before, the Zodiac was very highly intelligent, and I don't think that anybody that's crazy, or someone with brain damage can pull off some of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say. It's hard to say what, if he had problems with impulse control, maybe it wasn't a completely debilitating brain injury. Well, it's an interesting case.
While he was arrested, they were receiving more stuff from the Zodiac and stuff. So that's another thing but see, that doesn't mean anything either. He could have someone working with him or whatnot, or it just could not be him, but we'll never know.
Yeah. Well, while we're talking about Lawrence Kane, and, I talked prior about how he ties into the Kathleen Johns case in so much as she identified him as being the crazy driver that picked her up and messed up her car. I want to also point out that there was another case that he was tied to. And this is another ancillary case that might have nothing to do with the Zodiac, but a lot of sort of amateur sleuths think that perhaps it did have something to do with the Zodiac. And the reason I'm mentioning it now is because, okay, there was a young lady who was 25 years old in 1970, which means she would have been early 20s when the Zodiac stuff was going on. She lived actually not far from the Paul Stine killing. Okay, so again, her name was Donna Lass. So at the time when Paul Stine was killed, she lived not far away. She moved, however, to Lake Tahoe, California, South Lake Tahoe, California. Around the same time that Donna Lass moved there, this fellow that you were describing, Lawrence Kane, also moved to South Lake Tahoe, California. She got a job as a nurse at a Sahara hotel. And in the early morning hours of September 6, 1970, around 2 o'clock in the morning, she signs out of her logbook there at the hotel where she was working as a nurse. She leaves. Her car is later found at her apartment complex, but she's not there. And Donna Lass was never seen again. So, something that's interesting to point out here is that a man called her landlord and her employer at the hotel and said that there was a family emergency and she wouldn't be back for a while. This man has never been identified. Okay, now a while later, actually it was March 22nd of 1971, so it was not quite a year later, but a postcard was received by a man at the San Francisco Chronicle, a newspaper reporter named Paul Stein. And Paul Stein wrote a lot about the Zodiac case. And I'm going to show you this postcard. And this postcard, a lot of people say, is the evidence that ties the Donna Lass disappearance to the Zodiac Killer. Okay, you ready to see this?
I'm ready.
All right, so that is a modified postcard from the Sahara Club in Lake Tahoe. It's modified because there are things on there that actually aren't a part of the actual postcard. Peek through the pines. You see that down there in the lower right corner there? That is not a part of the postcard. Past Lake Tahoe areas is not a part. Sought victim 12 is definitely not a part of the Sahara Club postcard. But if you notice there in the upper right-hand corner, you see that little white circle?
Yes, I do.
That is a hole punch that was made in the card. And many people think that that hole punch somehow would lead you to the body of Donna Lass.
Oh, wow.
Now, you see obviously in the lower right-hand corner the Zodiac symbol. See it down there?
Oh, yeah.
Something interesting, though, about that postcard. A person from the San Francisco Police Department later said that that card was a forgery that was made by a very well-known detective in the Zodiac Killer case in order to drum up more publicity for either himself and or the case he was investigating. Now, if you guys know anything about the Zodiac case, you know that there was a detective on it named Dave Toschi. And he was reprimanded and he lost a lot of his credibility when he was accused of forging Zodiac letters in order to keep himself in the press. Now, I don't know if this inside informant was trying to say that Detective Toschi forged that postcard in a way to try and tie Donna Lass to the Zodiac case, or what. It could be that the Zodiac sent that postcard. Again, that doesn't mean the Zodiac killed Donna Lass, because the Zodiac took credit for everything.
Yeah, he did.
The Zodiac took credit for the Kathleen Johns incident that we were talking about, where she was picked up with her baby. And some people don't even know if that even happened. Some folks say that Kathleen Johns made that up entirely. What do you think? Do you think Kathleen Johns was picked up by a crazy guy?
Personally, no. Because I'm not convinced, because when they brought her in, she kind of looked over at the wall and saw the picture of Zodiac, and she was just instantly like, oh yeah, that's the guy, that's the guy. It's just very convincing that, like, she just happened to look over and saw a picture of, like, you know, the Zodiac Killer. Oh, that's the guy who picked me up. It was the Zodiac Killer. And I think that she just was trying to, you know, get attention, honestly.
And that's a good point, because a good way to get attention at that particular time in the San Francisco Bay Area was to somehow connect yourself to the Zodiac, because everyone was writing about it. It was very frightening. It was big news at the time. So let's say that she did want to just get some attention, that she was starved of that for whatever reason. To come up with a story like that would get you a certain amount of attention. And why not saddle up to the Zodiac? Now, I'm not saying that it didn't happen to her. I'm sure there's some sort of evidence. I mean, there had to have been, her car had to have been fucked up, because you can't just say the tire came off of my car and not show proof that the tire is off your car and you were driving on the rim for a few yards. So maybe she took her own tire off. You know, maybe she loosened her own lug nuts. Who knows? If it's a hoax.
That's true.
But I mean, I'm sure the cops wouldn't just take their word for, oh, my tire came off. But look, my car is perfectly functional. So there had to be some evidence to that. So I don't know. I don't know. Was she picked up by a crazy guy? Maybe. Was that the Zodiac Killer? Maybe. I don't know. The Zodiac, in a letter that he wrote later on, said that he picked her up. But the Zodiac liked to read newspapers and, again, liked to take credit for things. So that doesn't necessarily make it true either. If you think about it, too, it's not a bad way of throwing people off your trail. If you take credit for a crime you didn't commit, and then the person who committed that crime gets arrested, well, the cops might go after that person as being the Zodiac Killer, or at least investigate them because, hey, the Zodiac took credit for that, and now we know this guy did it. So in some ways, if it wasn't just a matter of Zodiac playing with people, it's a good strategy because it could lead cops down a different trail away from you for a minute or two. What do you think?
That's very true. That's very true. And he was smart enough to, you know, obviously do stuff like that. But yeah, I think it's a huge possibility.
So this is so these are some of the suspects we've gone over today and some of the cases that they're tied to. Now, incidentally, all of the cases that we went over here are not official Zodiac cases. Sherry Jo Bates is a possibility, but we don't know for sure. Donna Lass was in a totally different part of the state of California, and really the postcard is the only thing that gives you any indication that the Zodiac had anything to do with her disappearance. Kathleen Johns is definitely tied to the Zodiac case because people a lot of times point to that as being an incident that the Zodiac was involved in. But none of them were official Zodiac cases. So I think that's important to point out. Of these suspects, Ross Sullivan, Rick Marshall, Richard Gaikowski, and Lawrence Kane, who are you thinking, if you had just those guys in a room, and you had to say one of those guys was the Zodiac Killer, based on the evidence that we've talked about here today, who would you say amongst those four would be most likely in your opinion?
Rick Marshall.
Oh, you would say Rick Marshall. Interesting.
I feel like more evidence points to him. I feel like he's probably the best candidate of all of them. But
now, are you basing that on the handwriting primarily?
Yeah,
or?
the handwritings, the fact that he worked at the movie theater, the posters, a lot of stuff. But Ross Sullivan too. You know, that would probably be my second choice.
Okay.
What about you?
Well, Ross Sullivan would be lower on my list because I think he was too young and too outwardly disturbed to have been the Zodiac. But I think of these four, even though I don't think his personality really matches up, Gaikowski has a lot of circumstantial evidence against him. But, you know, it just seems like if he was the Zodiac and smiled, the witnesses would see those teeth from space. And it would be a dead giveaway. But no, I don't know. Of the four, I think Richard Gaikowski sounds the best, but I am really not even saying that with any degree of confidence. Basically, if I had these four in a room and I had to pick one of the four, I would probably pick an innocent man, is what I'm trying to tell you here right now. But something we were going to talk about this time, and we determined there's just no way to talk about this suspect without devoting more time to it. We were going to talk about a guy named Arthur Lee Allen. Now,
that would take up an entire hour alone.
Well, guess what, Zach? We're going to spend the whole hour on it next week.
Yeah.
So that's the plan. Next week, we're going to do an entire show about Arthur Lee Allen, who for a lot of people is like the #1 prime suspect. I know Richard, I've been thinking about Gaikowski and those teeth. I know Robert Graysmith is a huge proponent of Arthur Lee Allen being the Zodiac. So, you know, we're gonna delve into that for a whole hour. But that won't be until the flip side of 2019. Do you have any big plans for the new year, Zach?
Just talking about Arthur Lee Allen.
Yeah, that's about all the plans I have for the new year too. No, I was talking to you earlier. Like, I am such a homebody. I don't do anything on New Year's. Nothing. I'm such a boring person. You would never know it from the movies. You would think I'm around killing people all the time, but I'm really not. I'm just sitting at home writing.
No, don't fool anybody. You're really punching people through windows and playing axe croquet with people's heads.
Yeah. Well, you're not supposed. It's supposed to be between us, man.
Sorry, my mistake.
That's more evidence that I'm the Zodiac, besides my name being in all those ciphers.
We're giving clues in every chat that eventually we're going to end it all with you being the Zodiac.
You know, that would be awesome. Like at the very end of this series, whenever it ends, that we just reveal, it's like a Usual Suspects moment where that music starts to play and you just start seeing clips. And then it all starts to piece together. You know, like you put my head on some of these people's bodies and you do like black and white and shit. Put like some really big horn rim glasses on me and put me next to that composite. That sounds like a good conclusion, but we've blown it. We've blown it. We've given away the ending, Zach. Damn it. Way to go. But anyway, so that's what we're going to do next week is we're going to talk about Arthur Lee Allen. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I would like to hear what you think of these suspects, or if there are other suspects you want us to talk about. As long as they're not your stepfather, let me know. If it's your stepfather, keep that shit in your own basement, okay? So, Zach, I want to thank you for being on the show today. Did you have a good time?
I had a blast. Thank you for having me.
And for you guys who do something on New Year's Eve, I want you to stay very safe and don't do anything I wouldn't do. Well,
yes, be safe, everyone.
Yeah. But anyway, I will see you all on the flip side of 2019. Take care of yourselves. Have a good New Year's.